Good afternoon, everybody. Peter Salovey, President Peter Salovey, and all, and welcome to the second of this year's Tanner Lectures on Human Values by Achille Mbembe, professor at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg and at the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research at that university. Quick introduction today. We don't stand on too much formality on the second day of the Tanners. Remember, please, that we will reconvene here tomorrow morning at 10:30 for the final event of this year's Tanners, and that is a panel discussion among Professor Mbembe and Yale professors Inderpal Gruel and Michael Denning. I was in a funny conversation a couple of days ago with Achille and Michael about those occasions where you give a talk, and then someone stands up afterwards to summarize it, and you think to yourself, did I really talk about that? So I won't today take the risk of summarizing Achille's lecture from yesterday, but only signal a few of its themes, remind you of a few of its themes, and hope that he might recognize the signals as something he did indeed talk about. We learned yesterday about the new mobility regime of the lecture's title and its implications for the changing nature of borders and their effects in our world. We heard about the border as a zone of securitization and control, and about three different approaches to theorizing this zone, approaches that characterize those against whom the border is mobilized in terms of precarity, in terms of extreme vulnerability, of detention, incarceration, violence. But we also had a glimpse of something more hopeful, a border as a place even of rescue. And we heard, finally, fascinatingly and at some length, about an existential flip by which the features of borders at land and sea have been exchanged. The fluidity of sea borders, described, theorized, made almost mythic by Carl Schmitt, has now been transferred to land borders. This has happened because we live in that mobility regime of Achille's title. The medium of land borders is no longer land, but has become a fluid medium. And what does this medium consist of? The tens of millions of displaced human bodies defining new border zones by their movements. Zones then not limited to liminal spaces, but extending everywhere those movements reach. This might also look like a hopeful development, and perhaps we will see how it is so in today's lecture entitled The Idea of a Borderless World. But not so fast, because Achille was quick to remind us that in the era of digitized biometrics and securitized borders, even the fluid motions of millions can be tracked and controlled. We will find out. Achille?
Thank you very much, Gary. I indeed recognize myself in the in the brilliant summary of yesterday's lecture you have just given us. I would also like to thank the president of the university, Peter, who is with us this evening. Yesterday, I intimated that the government of mobility might well be one of the most important problems to confront the world during the first half of the 21st century. The capacity to decide who can move, who can settle, where and under what conditions, is increasingly becoming the core of political struggles over sovereignty, over nationalism, citizenship, identity, security, and freedom. I strongly suggested that with Western colonial expansion, and more decisively with the advent of capitalism, the raison d'être of the border is to attend to key questions such as to whom does the earth belong, who can lay what types of claims to what parts of it, and to the various beings who inhabit them, who determines its distribution or partition. In framing the question of the border in this way, I was trying to show that the power of the border lies in its capacity to regulate what are called the multiple distributions of populations, and by population I mean humans and non-humans, their distribution on the body of the earth, and in so doing to affect the vital forces of all kinds of beings. I also argued that as the 21st century unfolds, a global renewed desire from both citizens and their respective states for a tighter control of mobility is evident. Indeed, wherever we look, the drive is towards enclosure, or in any case towards an intensification of the dialectics of territorialization and deterritorialization, the dialectics of opening and enclosure. The belief that the world would be safer if only risks, ambiguity, and uncertainty could be controlled, and if only identities could be fixed once for all and secured, that belief is gaining momentum. And risk management techniques are increasingly becoming a means to govern mobilities. Such techniques are indeed proliferating. In particular, I highlighted the extent to which, as Gary was reminding us, the biometric border is extending into multiple realms, not only of social life, but of the body. That body are called the body that is not mine. Tonight, I would like to pursue this line of argument concerning the redistribution of the earth, not only through the control of bodies, but also through the control of movement itself and its corollary, speed, which indeed is what migration control policies are all about. Controlling bodies, but also movement itself and its corollary, speed. More specifically, I would like to see whether and under what conditions we could re-engineer the utopia of a borderless Africa, and by extension, a borderless world, since, as far as I know, Africa is part of the world, and the world is part of Africa. I would like to do that taking into consideration the contemporary matrix of flows, closures, and circulations, including the circulation of various forms of capital. Now you will ask me, but why is it important to attend once again to what is obviously a utopian intent, the question of a borderless world? I think it's important for a number of reasons. The first, which is, let's say, a philosophical reason, is that from its inception, movement, or more precisely borderlessness, has been central to various utopian traditions. When you look at the very concept of utopia, that is what it refers to. It refers to that which has no borders, beginning with the imagination itself. I think the power of utopianism resides in its ability to instantiate the tension between borderlessness, movement, and place. A tension, if we look carefully, that has marked social transformations in the modern era. This tension continues in contemporary discussions of movement-based social processes, particularly international migration, open borders, transnationalism, and even cosmopolitanism. When you read Kant on cosmopolitanism, Kant's discourse on cosmopolitanism is traversed from one end to the other by this tension between borderlessness, place, and movement. So it seems to me that in this context, the idea of a borderless world can be a powerful, albeit problematic resource for social, political, and even aesthetic imagination. The second reason is that precisely because of the current atrophy of the utopian imagination, apocalyptic imaginaries and narratives of cataclysmic disasters and unknown futures have colonized the spirit of our times. We find them everywhere, in popular culture, in political discourses, in cinema, in music. They are everywhere. Indeed, some of the ecological anxieties and fantasies of the apocalypse, I would argue, are the product of the Anthropocene. But what politics do visions of future catastrophe engender, if not a politics of separation, rather than a politics of the humanity as species coming into being as stewards of the earth? Because we inherit a history in which the consistent sacrifice of some lives for the betterment of others is the norm, and because these are times of deep-seated anxieties, including anxieties of racialized others taking over the planet, because of all of that, racial violence is increasingly encoded in the language of the border and in the language of security. As a result, contemporary borders are in danger of becoming sites of reinforcement, reproduction, and intensification of vulnerability for stigmatized and dishonored groups, for the most racially marked, the ever more disposable, those that in this era of neoliberal abandonment have been paying the heaviest of prices for the most expensive period of prison construction in human history. I refer to the prison here precisely to the carceral landscapes of our world precisely as the antithesis of movement, of freedom of movement. There's no dramatic opposite of the idea of freedom of movement than the prison. And the prison is a key feature of the landscapes of our times. So, in proposing to re-examine the question of a borderless Africa and a borderless world, I would like to stay away from dominant ways in which this issue has usually been dealt with. That is, under the sign of Kant and his promise of unbounded cosmopolitanism. And I would like to stay away from the other dominant approach to the question of a borderless world, the one under the sign of liberal individualism, understood as an antidote to the deeply ingrained fascist impulses of European governments and bureaucracies. We were referring yesterday at dinner with Gary to a very important chapter in Hannah Arendt's important classic book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. As chapter 2, it's called Race and Bureaucracy. The reference I have just made alludes to, indeed, that chapter which, as I was signaling, for some unknown reasons, has not really been the object of major consideration. So for those of you who are looking for a topic for your dissertation, there's one right there. Chapter 2, The Origins of Totalitarianism. So I would like to stay away from these two modes of approaching the question of a borderless world. Both of them, in fact, although they seem to be worlds apart, have something in common. They both are articulated around a concept you might hopefully know of, the concept of the fourth freedom. In classical liberal thought, there are three core freedoms. First of all, freedom of movement, and within freedom of movement, the movement of capital, of course, priority, number one. Because there's no capital without goods, the freedom of movement of goods, and more, especially in these times of ours, number three, services, the freedom of movement of those who can provide services. Those are the three freedoms, the three core freedoms. So the concept of the fourth freedom has to do with the freedom of movement of persons. So traditional engagements with the idea of a borderless world aim at precipitating the advent of that fourth freedom, which is freedom of movement of persons. And within that configuration, a borderless world would look something like this. It would be a world of free movement of capital, of goods, services, and persons. Such movement, such freedom of movement, would not be restricted to the core economically rich countries or states, which is the case as we speak, that the Schengen system, for instance, is limited to the core European countries. In fact, if you have an American passport, you can basically go wherever you want. The world belongs to you. But this is not the case for every inhabitant of our planet. So, in the configuration I have just referred to, the fourth freedom, the ability to move around the planet would no longer limited, to put it crudely, to Europeans and to Americans. It would be a radical right that would belong to everybody by virtue of each and every individual being a human being. So, it's a right that would be extended, including to poor members of the earth. So you see, we go back to this question of the earth. There would be no visas. I mean, in some, let's say, instantiations of the fourth freedom movement, there would be no visas, there would be no quotas, there wouldn't be any bizarre category to fill. First of all, because you wouldn't have to apply for a visa, so you wouldn't have to fill anything. There would be no application procedures preceding any move, which means that one could just get on a plane, on a train, on a boat, on the road, on a bike, rights of non-discrimination would be extended to all. So a borderless world would be a world in which circulatory and pendular migrations would be the norm, with, in fact, longer-term settlements less likely, since borders would be easy and open. I will give you one little example, please. When I was growing up, I mean, not so long ago, don't believe Gary when he says we met 25 years ago. We did, but we were both very, very young. So not so long ago, I was born in Cameroon. Cameroon used to be a German protectorate, which became, after the First World War, divided between the winning powers, England on the one hand and France on the other. I was born in the French part of Cameroon. And until the beginning of the 80s, it was possible to travel to France with one's identity card, national identity card. Most people went to France and came back. They didn't go there because they wanted to settle there. Most people want to live where they belong, quote unquote. But they want to be able to come and go. And they are more likely to come and go when the borders are not hermetically closed. So the borderless world imagined by the Fourth Freedom Movement is premised, therefore, on these rights of non-discrimination and on this circulatory and pendular set of migrations. Now, let me move on. I won't go further into those debates. They are both complicated and quite straightforward. There are those who support free movement of labor, and there are those who believe that it only intensifies levels of exploitation, especially of migrants. We can talk about it during the discussions. What I really want to do now is to, still in this attempt at elucidating or posing differently the question of a borderless world, what I would like to do is to contrast two paradigms. On the one hand, examine the liberal idea of a borderless world through the free movement, let's say, concept. So contrast it with African pre-colonial understandings of movement in space. That's what I want to do, in the hope that in contrasting these two paradigms, we might begin to, or let's say this will give us conceptual resources to expand on this utopian project of a borderless world. When I say liberal classical thought, of course, it is extremely complicated. You understand that. I don't have the time to go into all the nuances. I'm giving you a kind of archetype which needs to be itself properly deconstructed. And here I will rely in particular on a recently published work called Movement and the Ordering of Freedom. Just keep in mind that idea of the ordering of freedom. It's a work that has been published by Hagar Kotef, an Israeli scholar who teaches at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. And you might let your imagination work and understand why it is that it's an Israeli who is, let's see, interested in this. So what Hagar shows in that work is the extent to which liberal thought, liberal political thought, has in fact always been saddled with a contradiction when it comes to imagining the possibility of a borderless world. And her argument is that this contradiction, which I will elicit in a moment, stems from its conception of movement. She shows that, in fact, two dominant configurations of movement constantly come into conflict, relay each other, and at times cancel each other within classical liberal thought. Movement here is seen both as a manifestation of freedom and as an interruption of order, as a threat to order. And one of the functions of the state is therefore to craft a concept of order and stability and security that is reconcilable with its concept of freedom and its concept of movement. That is the contradiction. And to some extent, Hagar argues, the liberal classical state is the enemy of people who restlessly move around. Why? Because such people are configured as an inassimilable alterity. You cannot assimilate them. They are constantly on the move. And in fact, there are colonial repercussions of all of this. I mean, when colonialism sets foot in Africa, for instance, the biggest problem of the colonial state in the continent of Africa from the 19th century on is to make sure that people stay in the same place. It has a hard time bringing them to stay in the same place because the state believes that they are constantly on the move. They are, quote unquote, uncaptured. So the business of the state is how to capture them. Because, why do you want to capture them? You want to capture them precisely because without capturing them, sovereignty doesn't mean anything. Sovereignty means you capture people, you capture a territory, you delimitate borders, and this allows you, in turn, to exercise the different types of monopolies Max Weber spoke about, a monopoly over, of course, territory, a monopoly over the people, a monopoly in terms of the use of legitimate force, and very importantly, because everything else depends on that, a monopoly over taxation. But you can't tax people who have no address. Today here, tomorrow morning, they go and look for an aunt or an uncle, and the next week they have moved to a different entirely location. So the state sees such people as enemies both of freedom, because they abuse freedom, they do not exercise it with restraint, and enemies of security and order. You can't build an order on the basis of that which is unstable. So that's a very important aspect of, let's say, what classical liberal theory tells us about movement. The same state is a friend of self-regulated movement. Why? Because freedom is here understood as being about moderation. It's about self-regulation. It's not about excess. Excessive movement immediately conjures problems of security, and bound movement is seen as a threat. And I quote Hagar, freedom is only politically valuable if it relies on some mechanisms that regulate the movement that manifests it. I quote her, quoting Hobbes. So, as Kotev argues, movement not only had to be restrained via an array of disciplinary mechanisms, it had to be reconciled with freedom and to some extent self-restraint, but the ability to restrain oneself or to regulate oneself was not assumed to be the share of all subjects. That is, not everybody who is able to restrain himself or herself. Some movements were therefore configured as freedom, and others were deemed improper and were conceived as a threat. That's the bifurcation we have in classical liberal thought. At what point is it that a specific kind of movement by specific kinds of subjects is or is not a threat? That's the specter that haunts classical liberal states from those years up to now. We haven't got rid of that specter. So the way in which classical liberal states have tried to resolve this contradiction has been by putting forward the idea of managed mobility, which, by the way, is back on the agenda. Right now, as I speak, in Europe and even in South Africa, where I've been doing some work with the Department of Home Affairs on recalibrating intra-African migrations, the key concept is managed mobility. So, within the framework of managed mobility, and because of their perceived aberrant movements, certain categories of the population are constantly seen as posing a threat, not only to themselves, to their own security, but also to others' security. And such a threat, it is thought, can be diminished if their movements are confined and if they are domesticated and subject to some form or another of reform. And this is not new, in fact. This has been typical, indeed, of the ways in which different figures of mobility historically have become the foundation upon which different modes of governance were produced. In the West, generally taken, such way of one such mode of governance has consisted in instituting what is called a racial border. That you have physical borders, but you also have a racial border. Such was the case under colonialism. Such was the case, of course, in slave-owning and settler colonial societies. In all those places where settler liberty and freedom of movement required the criminalization of countless others, and such instances of criminalization and stigmatization became indispensable features of liberal government. I could go on and on that, but let me move on. We can pick it up during the discussion. Let me just capture what I have tried to say in one or two sentences, just for you to be able to keep it in mind, because now I'll be moving on and contrasting this model with the African pre-colonial model. So in the classical liberal model I was referring to, security and freedom, precisely because of the racial border, which some of us are particularly interested in, security and freedom came to be defined as a right of exclusion. Order within that model is about securing the unequal ordering of property relations. That's what it is. And asserting the boundaries of the nation goes hand in hand in that model with the assertion of the boundaries of race. Now, defining the boundaries of race within that model requires a proper definition of the boundaries of the body, as I was arguing yesterday. Thus, the centrality of the body in the calculus of both freedom and security. Now, let's look into what I call the African model. Here again, it's a very complex constellation. For lack of time, I will go straight to what matters, and then we will disaggregate it later on. First of all, let me say that pre-colonial Africa might not have been a borderless world, at least in the sense in which we have been defining borders since yesterday. But where they existed, borders were always porous and permeable. That, in fact, the business of a border is to be crossed. That is what borders are for. That there's no border, conceivable border, outside of the principle, the law of permeability. I can give you countless practical examples to instantiate this, but just believe me, for the time being, that's how it was. As evidenced by traditions of long-distance trade, circulation was fundamental. It was fundamental in the production of cultural forms, of political forms, of economic and social and religious forms. The most important vehicle for transformation and change was mobility. It was not, class struggles in the sense we understand it. It was mobility. Mobility was the motor of any kind of social or economic political transformation. In fact, it was the driving principle behind the delimitation and organization of space and territories. So, the primordial principle of spatial organization was movement, was continuous movement. And this is also still part of present day culture. To stop is to run risks. You have to be on the move constantly. More and more, especially in conditions of crisis, be on the move as a very condition of your own survival. Because if you are not on the move, the chances of survival are diminished. So dominance, to dominate sovereignty, was not exclusively expressed through the control of a territory physically marked with borders. It was not. Now you'll ask me, but how was it then? If you cannot control a territory, how can you exercise sovereignty? How can you extract anything, since, as far as we know, power expresses itself, manifests itself also, if not primarily, through one or the other form of extraction of something. All of that was expressed through networks. Networks, crossroads. For those of you who are familiar with African literature, the importance of roads and crossroads in African literature is astounding. I mean, read Soyinka, read Chinua Achebe, Amos Tutuola. Roads and crossroads are everywhere in that literature. So, crossroads, flows of people and flows of nature, both in dialectical relationship, because in those cosmogonies, people are unthinkable without what we call nature. So the realization, I mean, the Anthropocene turn, which seems to be a novelty in parts of our world today, I mean, we have always lived in that. It's not new. Because you cannot think of people without thinking of non-humans. And here again, I mean, read Tutuola. Is a world of humans and non-humans, interacting, acting with others, what Latour and others have called redistributed agency, typical of those kinds of, let's say, metaphysics of the human and the non-human. Now, I don't want to exaggerate this. To be sure, fixed geographical places such as towns and villages did exist. People and things could be concentrated in a particular location, and such places could even become the origin of movement, and there were links between places, links such as roads, I mentioned them, flight paths, but places were not described by points or by lines. What mattered the most was the distribution of movement between places. Movement was the driving force of the production of space, and movement itself, if we are to believe some of those cosmogonies here, have in mind the Dogon cosmogonies that were particularly studied by Marcel Griol, or other cosmogonies in equatorial Africa dealt with by anthropologists such as and historians such as Jan van Sina, Janssen, and others. Movement itself was not necessarily akin to displacement. It was what mattered the most was the extent to which flows and their intensities intersected and interacted with other flows, the new forms they could take when they intensified. So movement, especially among the Dogon, could lead to divergence, it could lead to convergence, it could lead to intersections. Convergence, divergence, and intersection were more important than points. They were more important than lines. They were more important than surfaces, lines, points, and surfaces, as we know, being cardinal reference in Western geometrics. So what we have here is, let's say, a different kind of geometry. It's a entirely different kind of geometry, out of which concepts of borders, concepts of power, concepts of relations, concepts of separation derive. So, the point is, if we want to harness alternative resources, conceptual vocabulary type, and all that, to imagine a borderless world, here is an archive. I'm not saying that is the only one, but what we have to harness are the archives of the world at large, and not only the Western archive. Because in fact, in the Western archive doesn't help us to develop an idea of borderlessness. The Western archive is premised on the crystallization of the idea of a border. That we have to check later on. I'm just saying it as a provocation. So I could go on and on these alternative geometries. Let me just add one or two things. In this configuration, wealth and power or let's say wealth in people always trumped wealth in things. There were two forms of wealth. You could be wealthy in terms of your capacity to agglomerate around you clients, family members, and so forth and so on. Or you could be wealthy just by virtue of having accumulated a huge amount of quantity of things. So you see here dialectics of quantities and qualities, qualities of persons, categories of persons being at play here. And multiple forms of membership were always available. You would be astonished. You take one society and look into the dictionary of forms of membership. How is it that one belongs? Through what window is it that you can enter the house? Multiple forms of membership. Not a kind of rigid classification where either you are a citizen or you are a foreigner. In between being a citizen and being a foreigner, there was a whole repertoire of alternative forms of membership. And building alliances through trade, marriage, or religion, incorporating newcomers, refugees, asylum seekers into existing polities, that was the norm. You dominate by integrating foreigners. All kinds of foreigners. And just to add to what I have just said, peoplehood, I'm not talking about nationhood, peoplehood included not only the living, but also the dead and the unborn, humans and non-humans, exactly in line with all we are being told about in this age of the Anthropocene. And community was unthinkable without some kind of foundational debt. You know, there are two principal forms of debt. There is a kind of debt that is, I would say, expropriatory. Kind of debt, I mean, banks, some of you, some of us are indebted to banks. Okay, you pay interest. If you don't pay interest, you wake up one morning and the amount to pay for the interest has overtaken the amount you borrowed in the first instance. So that's a form of debt I call expropriatory. But in this constellation, human constellation talking about, there's a different kind of debt that is constitutive of the very basis of the relation. And it's a kind of debt that encompasses not only the living, the now, but also those who came before and those who will come after us. That we have obligations to that chain of beings, which include, once again, not only humans, but animals, but what we call nature, and so forth and so on. Okay, I can come back to that if you want to have further comments. Let's just so you see what I'm getting at. So those are the two models. Once again, these are archetypes. They have to be properly historicized. What are the social forces driving what? What are the limits? We all understand that. So, where are we today? It seems to me that worldwide, the combination of fast capitalism, and we mentioned it yesterday, the saturation of the everyday by digital and computational technologies, these two things have led to the acceleration of speed and the intensification of connections. In fact, the world is so connected today. Today, basically, you can sit where you are, you have access to new technologies, and you have access to an amount of knowledge we have never had access to. That is going on. At the same time, willful ignorance is a feature of our times. How come we know so less when the amount of knowledge we have has never been as astounding as it is? Whatever the case, it seems to me that ours is, in this regard, an era of planetary entanglement. But this is not all. As Paul Virilio is a French scholar, but not only him, countless others have suggested the twin phenomena of immediacy and instantaneity is presently one of the most pressing problems confronting us, or in any case, one of the most determining factors ushering a new techno-political epoch. Since yesterday I have been trying to bring in discussion this event, which is our emergence into a new technological age, because we can't simply understand what's going on if we don't factor in these new technological developments. So it seems to me that, in line with Virilio and the others, that one of the most pressing problems confronting us, ushering us into this new techno-political epoch, has to do indeed with the twin phenomena of instantaneity and immediacy. So in considering what borders have become, the kind of work they are doing today, not yesterday, now, or in considering what a borderless world or borderless Africa might look like, it might be useful to take seriously the possibility that real time now prevails above both real space and the geosphere in general. And that's really the key argument I would like to push tonight. The supersession of real space by real time. Something that is made possible precisely because of this techno-political event that is driven by all we have been referring to since yesterday. The primacy of real time, of immediacy and instantaneity over and above space, over and above territory, over and above surface, might not yet be irreversible, but it is in the process of becoming what we could call a fait accompli. Even if we wanted to reverse it, it might be too late. That's what a fait accompli is. A fait accompli is also, by the way, that which nobody can account for. So, the question of unaccountability, the impossibility to account for, or the difficulty to account for, which means the difficulty to take responsibility for. In fact, of the three main physical barriers, which science teaches us, barrier of sound, of heat and light, the first two have already been felt. The sound barrier, and here I quote Virilio, has been cut across by the super and hypersonic aircraft, while the heat barrier is penetrated by the rockets taking human beings outside the Earth's orbit in order to land them on the moon. But the third barrier, still Virilio speaking, that of light, is not something one can cross. You crash into it. It is precisely this barrier of time which confronts history in the present day, he adds. So, building on Virilio's remarks, we can argue that the moment humanity will reach the light barrier, that is, the speed of light, a historical event of unprecedented importance will happen, which might throw history itself in disarray and might jumble up the relation of the living beings towards the world. What do I mean by that? By that I mean, when it happens, then we will have entered a borderless world. We'll enter a borderless world when, let me put it differently, when humanity reaches the light barrier. Because territory, it won't vanish, it will still be there, but it will become irrelevant. It will become irrelevant because, precisely, we will have finally domesticated absolute speed, and having done so, the Earth will enter a new period of its deep history, one in which real time will really have superseded real space. So, let me just say that we are not yet there. We might not get there in our lifetime, some of us at least. But take, for instance, algorithmic trading, also known as high-frequency trading, computerized, fully automated. It is obvious that algo financial markets are but one dimension of the ecology of high-speed materiality that is transforming not only the nature of market access in our time, but also, I should add, the very nature of borders. And in that sense, it's not simply a technological development. So, what I'm arguing for is that in order to imagine a borderless world, we have to go beyond the liberal idea of movement and speed and somewhat draw from other archives. I'll end all of this now by putting on the table a notion I take from the Ghanaian constitution. The Ghanaian constitution of Ghana has developed a concept I haven't found anywhere else. It is the concept, a new right they call the right of abode, A-B-O-D-E, as a fundamental right that is, they want to add to the list of traditional human rights. It seems to me that this idea of the right of abode is a cornerstone for any imagination of Africa as a borderless space. I say this because if Africa is to contribute to the unfolding global debate on human mobility in this age of planetary entanglement, it needs to indeed dig deeply into its own archives. In a world in which arrest, detention, incarceration, including at sea, abandonment, deportation, are seen as the most efficient ways of dealing with economic migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, we should draw from our own historical perspective, experience, as African and diasporic people, and articulate a proposal for ourselves and for the world, which is radically different from the anti-humanist norms and practices currently prevalent on matters concerning management of human mobility in the world. I say this because at a deep historical level, African and diasporic struggles for freedom and self-determination have always been intertwined with the aspiration to move unchained. Whether under conditions of slavery, Atlantic slavery, trans-Saharan slavery, or under colonial rule, the loss of our sovereignty automatically resulted in the loss of our right to free movement. This is the reason why the dream of a free, redeemed, and mighty African nation, what Marcus Garvey called a bright star among the constellation of nations, this is why this dream has been inextricably linked to the recovery of the right to come and go without let or hindrance across our colossal continent. In fact, our history in modernity has been, to a large extent, one of constant displacement and confinement, forced migrations, and coerced labor. Think of the plantation system in the Americas and the Caribbean. Think of the black codes, the pig laws, or the vagrancy statutes after the failure of the Reconstruction in the United States in 1887. Think of the chain gangs laboring at tasks such as road construction, ditch digging, tearing, deforestation, and so forth and so on. Think too of the Code de l'Indigène in French colonial Africa, of the Bantustans and labor reserves in Southern Africa, and of the carceral industrial complex in today's United States of America. In each instance, to be African and to be black has meant to be consigned to one or the other of the many spaces of confinement modernity invented. The scramble for Africa in the 19th century and the carving of its boundaries along colonial lines turned the continent into a massive carceral space, and each of us into a potential illegal migrant, unable to move except under increasingly punitive conditions. As a matter of fact, entrapment became the precondition for the exploitation of our labor, which is why the struggles for emancipation and racial upliftment were so intertwined with the struggles for the right to move freely. So, if we want to conclude the work of decolonization, we have to bring down colonial boundaries in our continent and turn Africa into a vast space of circulation for itself, for its descendants, and for anyone who wants to tie his or her fate with our continent. Thus, the importance of the concept of the right of abode as written in the Ghanaian Constitution. Thank you very much.
You talk eloquently about the importance of movement without visas and without, any kind of application process. And it's very moving to think of it in those terms, in terms of the traditional constitution of Africa as a carceral space. But at the same time, you also talk about the importance of indebtedness, that we're indebted to the dead, and to some extent, we're also indebted, or we can be held answerable to the future, to our descendants. It seems to me that the two actually point in slightly different directions, in the sense that being indebted or acknowledging that we are, that somebody else will hold us in their debt, whatever, that one form or another, either forward-looking or backward-looking, that puts us in a kind of a sequel in which we do occupy a space that is not, cannot be freely relinquished. So I just wonder if you could comment a little bit about the sense of unbounded mobility on the one hand, and the sense of being obligated and being held by our obligation, which implies a certain kind of constraint.
Should we take a few questions, or Gary? Okay, maybe I'll take two.
So my question pertains a little bit to the porous borders. In some cases, it does seem that there are regimes or arrangements where borders are becoming more porous, but the exchange is extreme surveillance and monitoring. And I can think of a few cases where it's relatively easy to enter various spaces, countries, but the exchange is that there's better biometric information, as you alluded to, but also better surveillance, whether it's monitoring you via your phone, via satellite, via drone. And I wonder if perhaps one of the directions that some of these arrangements might be going in is you can go wherever you want, but we're going to know exactly what you're doing, where you are, who you're meeting with. So there's a freedom of movement, but there's no longer really a freedom to anonymity or to privacy. Thanks.
See, I have my own convictions on each of the issues I put on the table. We can talk about that. I was trying to offer a way in which we can recapture in these times of utopian atrophy, we can recapture the utopian resources that are embedded in the idea of a world that wouldn't have any border. And in particular, a continent, for the reasons I mentioned at the end, that would become really free for its people and would speak to the world from that position. So that's the framework I was trying to build. And of course, as far as unbounded mobility is concerned, I think that it's a project we have to take seriously. We have to take it seriously, whether or not it is actually feasible. In fact, we have to hold dear onto it precisely at the moment when it appears to be totally utopian. I argue in that way for all kinds of reasons, one of which has to do with what I really believe is our entry into a planetary age. This doesn't mean that nation states don't exist any longer. They are still there. I'm not subscribing to the kind of discourse of happy globalization we witnessed in the 90s, when many believed that, in fact, nation states were going to disappear. If anything, they have shown that they are extremely resilient and they can mutate with the times. So we have to hold on to that, precisely because in spite of their existence, none of the issues humanity is dealing with today can be resolved at a national level alone. So I put forward this renewed idea in the hope that this renewed planetary consciousness might force us to address the questions I was putting forward yesterday. Whose earth is this? Rather than whose country is this? How do we distribute it? Meaning not how we conquer it for ourselves, but meaning how do we share it? How do we share it? Because sharing it is the very condition of its sustainability. At a moment when the possibility of extinction is real, it is plausible. It's not implausible. So the question of inhabitation of the world at large, of the earth, the question of sharing it as a condition for its own durability, those questions become extremely important, especially if we want to move beyond just an ethnographic description of how borders work and the kind of work they accomplish. So if we want, the project is to inject contemporary debates on migration, movement, mobility with the kind of philosophical and theoretical urgency that is made available to us with the realization that we have entered a techno-planetary age. And then the questions of unboundedness and obligation to a locality, it seems to me they can be reshaped differently. That would be a way of, let's say, commenting on your comments. You see, on the one hand, if I limit myself to the continent, what we are really witnessing is a double process, one of closure, the other one of an acceleration in terms of opening of African borders. Now, there are 27 countries in the continent where if you have an African passport, you can obtain your visa at arrival. That wasn't the case 2 or 3 years ago. It's now the case. Last week, they signed in Kigali a new treaty, the same kind of treaties, you see everywhere, NAFTA and the rest. So they are moving along those directions. They want a free market for the whole continent. But as I was suggesting, it seems to me that the most plausible way probably to dismantle national borders in the continent might have to go through domestication of new technologies. I really believe that paradoxically, not that technologies are neutral, but they are the most direct way in which colonial boundaries in Africa will fall. I can give you plenty of examples of how this is already happening. So on the one hand, borders are becoming a bit more porous than before, but on the other hand, there is a global drive to turn the continent into a carceral space. Very few Africans are welcomed as migrants anywhere in the world. You give me one example of Africans arriving in any part of the world where they are welcomed. Europe, in its attempt at reinforcing its southern boundaries, is actively recruiting a number of transit countries in making sure that its borders are extended in the continent itself. But you can't have a situation where people cannot go out and they cannot circulate from within. That double penalty is, it seems to me, one of the biggest threats to the movement of people right now.
Thank you, Achille. I was just listening to you today and yesterday. I was thinking about, or I was reminded of one of Derrida's deep frustration with Kant. And his frustration was that Kant restricted his concept of cosmopolitanism to the right of visitation and hardly ever to the right of residence. And it seems to me that what is central to your talk, what was central to your talk today and your talk yesterday was the idea of moving freely. And I wonder if you could perhaps talk a bit more about the tween question of settling freely.
Of?
The right to settle freely as opposed to move freely. Settle. Residence.
Oh, residence.
As opposed to visit.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I see. So settling as opposed to moving. Frankly, I don't know why I didn't pay attention to to settling. Maybe because of the anti-sedentary bias. That is my own bias. But I have the feeling that, what we are all encouraged to do today is to settle. Especially stay where you are. Just stay where you are. Don't move around. And therefore, I was not interested in that part. And I haven't thought about it. I don't think that is the problem today. I don't know what you think, but it seems to me that we are all encouraged to stay where we are, not travel too much, not settle elsewhere, just be where we belong. And so the best way to shake that is to look into the opposite, which is how do we make sure that we move? How do we make sure that settlement is not the same as confinement, which it has been, in some people's histories. In the plantation, you quote unquote settle, and if you move, then it's an attempt. It's a crime against property. So I haven't thought about it, but I will think about it. Yes.
I want to say thank you. You've given us so much to think about and powerful images for thinking differently about the world we're in. And your account of Africa resonated very much with our thinking about the Americas, where migrants are clamoring for the right not to migrate as well as the right to migrate, and they link the protection of mobility to the possibility of restoration of home, and are also asking for something besides the path to citizenship as the means to achieve and redeem themselves as persons with protection and legal status. So your critique of the liberal framework about freedom and security is very well taken. My question is for the economics a bit within this technology. My work recently, I've been looking at the use of X-ray and the tracking, and I think it goes to this question about settling, is that there is a category of people who in the imagination of the state are not meant to live socially, right, and in relation, but to be the surplus who can be brought and left, so that along with immobility is the forced migration and the guest worker program and the category of existence in which they live so long away from home that they no longer have that capacity of social relation, or where, because they're incarcerated, the future growth of their population in the U.S. will be limited, right, where there's a biopolitical project around race. But the work that I've been doing with X-ray, and I wanted to hear you talk more about the body, is an optic of state control, of looking inside the body, that is doing something different from, it seems to me, other regimes of race and racial profiling. You said very powerfully the way it travels with the person and becomes part of the person's biography and works against the capacity of the person to represent themselves. But it also, it seems to me, is really, again, linked to this production of an ideal non-person who can be made into a unit of work, a unit of value, even as they're represented in political discourse as the refuse of nations, as people who are in their improper place, who are surplus. Do you know what I mean? So there's the discourse that says these are the surplus people. right, who no longer really, who are improperly here. But they're being produced as non-persons in a way statelessness for an economic function in ways that I'd love to hear you maybe think about with me, because I hear very much the beautiful work that you've done around the political order of things, and I just wanted to ask you to think the economic logic of that border space a little bit more, if you get my question. I have too many questions at once, I think, is my problem.
I think we can deal with some of them tomorrow. Since I'm looking at Gary and Peter and the clock.